This is your Daily 5 for Thursday, February 12th, 2026. I received a very, very stark reminder earlier today that not everybody, when you're into something, as I am into movies, and when you get deep into the weeds of these different things, you start to forget that not everybody has the same level of interest in different forms of entertainment as you do. You just kind of assume people know what certain terms are and what they mean. And I did that. I was talking to a colleague and I was discussing the films that Lando and I are watching for our commentary series to celebrate Black History Month. And at one point, as I was talking about the movies we've watched already, I used the description of blaxploitation for some of the films. I mean, really, it covers the first three films, front to back, depending on how you look at it. Or at least Black Dynamite is mimicking the blaxploitation genre, although I would actually say it is itself a blaxploitation film. That's how well made it is. But I used that term, and the person I was talking to had a very visceral reaction to me saying that word. And I stopped and I said, "What?" And this person said, "What does blaxploitation mean?" And then it occurred to me that this person clearly wasn't as into movies as I am, and also quite a bit younger than I am, which again, you sort of just forget. You think everybody's on the same page culturally and has come up with the same stuff. And so I had to explain. And what it became very clear was that this individual thought that a blaxploitation film, which does make some sense if you think about the words that form that term, black and exploitation, and the current moment that the United States finds itself in, this person thought I was talking about movies that were in fact advocating for the exploitation of black people instead of what it actually is. And by the way, I'm going to use the most widely superficially accepted term, because if you go into film fandom forums or you go on Reddit and start looking for people that are going to go back and forth on what blaxploitation means, you can see some crazy debates. But in generally, the genre is seen as a movement starting in the early 70s for black artists to attempt to reclaim some of the cultural kind of representation of themselves by putting their stamp, their personality, their concerns into film. That's what it is generally. Like I said, if you want to go crazy and see people debating what films should and shouldn't be considered blaxploitation, you will find no shortage of rabbit holes where people do that. Holy cow. Like I said, good way to kill an afternoon, but if you want to see your head like spin around when people make certain arguments, that's a good way to do it. Or really any genre of film, to be honest. But anyway, I explained this. And then the demeanor was completely different once they understood what I was actually talking about. But it was this really stark reminder that not everybody is going to have the same deep level understanding of, I mean, every form of entertainment has this. And it would be the same with this. And this is not necessarily even a slam against younger people. My mother, if I were to try to explain to my mother the difference between Tenebrae, Friday the 13th, the original, and say Hostel, the Eli Roth film. If I were to attempt to explain the differences in those films, my mother would at the end of the day say, yeah, they're all horror films. She wouldn't care whatsoever about the fact that, yes, technically they're all horror films, but they are wildly different in their intent, in their execution, and in their quality. These are just not at all of the same thing. But for someone who doesn't care about horror films, which my mother does not at all, probably the closest she comes is Jaws, which another good example is compare Jaws to Hostel. Both technically horror films, depending on how you look at it, or maybe thrillers. Or actually, I don't know if Hostel would be a thriller. But again, my mother would just file them all under the same thing. She would see them all the same way. Maybe not Jaws, but she would definitely see the other three as the same thing. And she would just say, oh yeah, that's not something I'd be interested in. And it would not matter if I spent 10 minutes or 10 hours with a whiteboard and a bunch of examples to illustrate why Friday the 13th, Hostel, and Tenebrae are not the same type of movie. It just wouldn't matter. And it's the same thing here. If you're not into film, and if you didn't grow up knowing what these films were in any way, then that term, saying blaxploitation, you can understand why somebody would jump to a negative interpretation of it. So again, there's really no overall point to this. I just found it an amusement that in the midst of explaining why this is so fun to do these films and to talk about them, I was very, very starkly reminded that not everybody's fandom is the same, and it doesn't always translate until you explain it. Later.